House of Israel International Services are held weekly at 3601 Rose Lake Drive, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28217, 11 a.m. Saturday mornings and 7 p.m. Thursday evenings, Eastern Time. This live broadcast is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Motivating. Inspiring. Challenging. Encouraging. Deepening. Strengthening. And enhancing your faith. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to House of Israel International's live worship service.
We are, as I said, in 3 John, the Epistle of John. The introduction of 3 John is very similar to the introduction in 1 John and in 2 John. And so what I want to do here is read the actual chapter, and then we'll take some time and go through it. The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church or the ecclesia, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. I wrote unto the ecclesia, the church, the called out ones, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he receive himself the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and cast them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of Elohim, but he that doeth evil hath not seen Elohim. Demetrius hath good report among of all men, and of the truth itself, yea, and we also bear record, and you know that our record is true. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet the friends by name. When we look at 3 John, we come to the conclusion that this writer is John. And the conclusion we've come to is because that is what we have been told. That is what we have read about. The historians, Eusebius and others who are historians when it comes down to the history of the called out ones, have written that John wrote 3 John. They also conclude that John wrote 1 John and John wrote 2 John. And therefore, John wrote John. The challenge, as we discussed in 1 John, is that in the 2nd and 3rd century, there was one who began to challenge whether or not John, the apostle, whom was the son of Zebedee and the brother of James, if he was the actual writer. The conclusion was, since John is not mentioned in the Gospel of John, in other words, he doesn't identify himself as the writer, and John does not identify himself as the writer of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and the writer of Revelation is John, and in Revelation, John identified himself as John, then one concluded that the John who wrote Revelation, based on the fact that he identified himself as John in Revelation, but neglected to identify himself in the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, that must mean that it's a different John. And so that has caused some debate, and it, I think, is a logical debate. But we also have to take the same argument in other writings, because we know that Matthew doesn't identify himself as the writer of Matthew. His name is not mentioned other than as a disciple of Messiah, and that seems to be from the commentary point who's identifying the 12 tribes, or if Yeshua is speaking concerning them. Mark is not mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. His name is nowhere there, other than in Paul's writings and in Luke. Luke is not mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. But we know that the writer of Acts is Luke, and that the person who wrote the book of Acts is writing primarily to the same person, this guy who is a lover of Jehovah, who he identifies in 1st Luke, and then 2nd in the writers or Acts of the Apostles. And so those are the kinds of arguments that individuals try to get into to identify whether or not this is an authentic writing of a particular person. And so we know that John is the conclusion, but which John? Believe it or not, Mark's name was John. It was called John Mark. There are others who are identified as well, because it was a common name, Yochanan. Yochanan, just as Yeshua. Yeshua was a common name. Yaakov, all of these names were pretty much common, just like in any nationality, in any language, there are some common names, and then there are some quite unique names. And so when it comes down to trying to exegete and identify the particular writers, then that is a process by which theologians and historians try to identify the accuracy. The date of the writing has a 10-year span. And if, in fact, the writer of John is the same writer of Revelation, then we know that Revelation was written from the Isle of Patmos, and John was imprisoned there. It has been dated somewhere between 95 and 96 AD. And so we know from this particular writing, 1st John, 2nd John, and 3rd John, John is writing because he concludes in the last epistle as he identifies the elect lady and then the elect lady's sister, and he's not going to complete all of the thoughts that he has and put them in writing because he expected to see them soon. And so someone who is in prison is not writing as if they are expecting to see someone soon, and specifically saying he's going to come to them. And John concludes this letter very similar. So it is believed that if in fact this is the same John, this is prior to his imprisonment in the Isle of Patmos. The person that it is written to whom is an individual, and this individual's name is Gaius. And we'll look at a little bit about Gaius here in just a moment. Why? This is the important reason, is why would John write? Because from these particular questions, you get to understand, especially to whom it's written, because there's certain things that have been written that were specific to the people that they were written to. If someone was to write a letter to Dan, and they're addressing Dan in the letter, and 300, 400 years later, 1,000 years later, I get a hold of the letter that was addressed to Dan, and I try to now apply what is specifically written to Dan to me. Or if someone is writing about a particular situation that is going on in Ephesus, particular issues that is going on in Corinth, particular issues that is going on in Philippi, particular emphasis or interest that is, or issues that is going on with Timothy or with Titus, or particular issues that is going on in Colossae, and then 300-400 years later, 1,000 years later, we find those letters and we take what is written to Colossae as if it was written to us, or we take what is written to Philippians as if it's written to us. It would be no different than taking what is written to Dan and applying it to us. And so there are things we can learn from what is written, but to try to directly apply some things may be problematic. And this is where rightly dividing and exegeting, pulling out what is there instead of eisegeting, reading into it, because you can easily come to the wrong conclusion. And so why did John decide to write to Gaius? As we identified in 1 John and in 2 John, if we were to permit ourselves to really use our brain. Now, I know that's a scary thing when you're dealing with religious entities in religious systems. But if we were bold enough to think outside the box normally, a normal person who has a brain and common sense will probably come to different conclusions that people who are super spiritual. You see, when Paul is writing to these individuals, one, we know that he's not writing something that is deep and with hidden meanings, because he's writing to some folks that have already demonstrated they ain't spiritual. When he writes to 1 Corinthians, the first letter to Corinth and the second letter to Corinth, the first letter indicates that there was a letter before that, which would make 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians, 3 Corinthians, because he said in 1 Corinthians, I wrote to you not to keep company with fornicators. But we don't have that letter. But he indicated that he had written a letter. Okay? And so if we use our brains, we would have to say, well, how can this be the first letter he wrote to the Corinthians when he says in the first letter that he wrote to them, and we don't have that letter, you see. But we also would have to conclude, if he's writing to individuals and he's saying, when I came to you, I could not speak to you on a spiritual level because you were carnal. And even now, you're still carnal. So to write to carnally minded people some deep spiritual insight that requires you to be a master interpreter on the third or fourth level of Torah at least, to comprehend what Paul is writing, he said they weren't spiritual. And so John is writing to this guy named Gaius. Why? To encourage him to continue to help those whom John had sent, and to continue to stand even though the leader within the community, Diotrephes, wanted to have the preeminence, or he wanted to be the only teacher. That's really what it boils down to, that he wanted to be the only teacher and that there would be no other teachers, even those who had been authorized by John. Now, the interesting thing that this particular letter doesn't tell us in 1 John and 2 John, it doesn't necessarily gives us, 1 John specifically doesn't necessarily gives us a specifics, so that has been deemed a circular letter, meaning that it could apply to anyone. 1 John, of course, we know there's a 2 John, there's an elect lady, but we don't know her name and we don't know where she lived. We do know that there were people there who loved the truth. This particular letter is speaking of a guy named Gaius, a person named Diotrephes, another person named Demetrius, but it doesn't give us a location geographically where they may be. And therefore, we're left to try to fill in some blanks if there are blanks to be filled in, or we can simply take it at face value, which I think would be the safest and, of course, the wisest. The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And so this person we see, and John identifies himself as an elder, and as we talked last week, even though John was an apostle and Paul was an apostle and Peter was an apostle, that was a calling, but they also operated in the office. And we can't confuse a calling with an office. There is apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher. These are gifts that Jehovah gave through Yeshua to his called out ones. There's the office of elder, there's the office of deacon, there's the office of bishop. These are things, these are offices that a man or woman can desire. Desiring to be an apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, or teacher is not something that we can desire and move into if we have not been called. Somebody can't appoint you to be an apostle. They can't appoint you to be a prophet unless you are their prophet, not the prophet of Jehovah. And so John identifies himself as an elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom he loved. And this word Gaius is a Greek form of a Latin name, Gaius, meaning I am glad and rejoice. And so Gaius he had a Greek type name, a Greek form of a Latin word. And so we don't know if Gaius was Greek, if he was Roman, but because it was a Greek form of a Latin name, we know the Romans were the occupiers during Gaius's time. And so he says Gaius, which again is meaning to be glad and to rejoice. But then he uses the word well-beloved, agapetos, meaning beloved, esteemed, a favorite, worthy of love. In other words, his name was glad and rejoiced, but he was well beloved. In other words, he was a favorite, it seems as if John loved him to the degree that he had favor with Gaius. And there was a reason, because Gaius was someone who was kind, Gaius was generous, Gaius showed hospitality, Gaius opened himself, his home up to those whom John sent, and we see here in a minute the opposition of that. He says, beloved, speaking of Gaius, which is the same word as well, beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as as thy soul prospereth. And so the word wish here is from the Greek word ekuma, And what John is praying is that Gaius prosper materially, bodily, spiritually, and soully. In other words, he's saying, I want above all things that you may prosper. Now, there's a specific reason why he uses this particular term for prosper. And then he says that that word wish there is another form of saying, I pray. When he says, I wish above, he said, I'm praying that above all. And as you look at the meaning of the word that he uses as far as wish, it's not the same wish as we speak, especially as people are blowing out candles. I wish upon a star or that kind of stuff. No, he's saying, I'm praying to Elohim. I pray to Elohim. I wish or to wish to pray for. And so he's saying, I'm praying to Elohim above all things that you may prosper. Now, this particular word prosper is used in a variety of ways, because one of the ways it is used in the Torah is that if you are going somewhere, to wish or pray that you have a prosperous journey means that you get to your destination without any problem. There is no trouble. You're not running into bandits. You're not having a flat tire. There's no accident. There's no detours that is going to hold you up for a day or two. There's no weather problems that is going to cancel your flight. None of those things. You leave and you reach your destination without any incident. That is one way that it is used in the Torah among the prophets, and even in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. And so it says, to grant a prosperous and expeditious journey, to lead by a direct and easy way, to grant a successful issue, to cause to prosper, be successful. And so the usage there is prosper 3 times in the Greek, and to have a prosperous journey once in the Greek, but many times in the Hebrew if we were in the Hebrew writings. And then he says, for I rejoice greatly. Now, here's why he's praying for John to prosper. Because for Gaius to prosper, because John understands certain principles. He says, for I rejoice greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee. So here's what has happened. Some individuals have come to to Gaius's place of worship, or Gaius's home. And Gaius received them. Gaius welcomed them. Gaius discerned their message and understood that some of these individuals, even though they hadn't been sent by John, had the same message that John's disciples had. They could have been Peter's disciples. They could have been some of Paul's disciples or some of the other apostles' disciples, but Gaius received them. And not only that, they recognized, because this is the thing, truth attracts. Remember, John wrote last week, he said, those who love truth love those who love truth. When you walk in truth and you find someone that is walking in truth, there is an instant, there's a connection there. There's like a soul, almost tie that developed. And that's a good soul tie. I know every time we hear soul ties, it's something bad. But when your soul connects to another soul in righteousness, that's a righteous soul tie. Hallelujah. And so when you recognize and identify Now all of a sudden, it's like, I have been thirsty, but I know how to drink. But I've been here thirsty by myself. And I've learned, I know how to drink from the word, and I know how to eat from the word, and I know how to live in a dusty place with a bunch of heathens. But man, there is someone here that now I can sit down and talk to. I can relate to. I can communicate with. And so these brothers connected with Gaius, but after they left Gaius and they got back around John and there's conversations, they're testifying about Gaius. But they're also testifying about a couple of other people. And he says, and testify, when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. And so John, although he is speaking of his spiritual children, or those whom he birthed in Messiah, which we're going to see, feels like any parents who know that their children is walking in truth. Contrary, it is not a good feeling when you know your children or loved ones are not walking in truth. John says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. And so those of us who have children who are walking in truth, you know what that feels like. You also know what it feels like to have children that don't. You see. And so what John is saying, listen, I got testimony. If somebody comes to you after visiting your child and they said, you know what, your son, your daughter has a beautiful spirit. Your son and your daughter, they just love truth. Your son and your daughter, they talk about the word. Your son and your daughter, it's like being around them is like being around you. Right? That's a good report. And you pray and hope that they don't get around another one of your sons. Because have you ever had somebody who came to you and said, I met such and such, and it's like, okay. all right, what's coming next? Because you know him, right? It is like you almost prepare yourself for a worst case scenario. And some people are very nice about how they talk to you about, that heathen child of yours. But you have to read between the lines because they know it's still your child. And even though it's a heathen, you'll fight over your child, right? Even the heathen ones. So, but you know the feeling. You know what I'm talking about. And so John here is saying, and it's almost as if when he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. If you remember in 2 John, he wrote to the elect lady, and he said, I was so happy to hear that your children is walking in the truth, or some of your children is walking in the truth. And so when John makes this statement about Gaius, I come to the conclusion, especially with Gaius' Greek form of a Latin name, that if Gaius is not Hebrew, then how did he come into this truth? Because if he was in Judaism or in some other religion, then someone had to minister to him and disciple him. And by the fact that John is calling him his child or his children suggests that, and there's nothing wrong when I've experienced in the church my spiritual son, my spiritual daughter. This is my son in the ministry. And it's like, okay, did that person have faith before you met them? If the person had faith before you met them, you didn't birth them. If the person didn't have faith and you found them and they didn't know anything about the truth, and their born again experience was in relationship to their contact with you, then in essence you birthed them in the spirit. And this is what Paul talked about the Corinthians. He says, I birthed you all. In other words, the very fact that you all are believers is a testimony to my apostleship. And it's not that he was claiming them as his property, but he was identifying them as ones who had been born again in his ministry, who did not know the Messiah until he came and preached the Messiah, and so he could actually say, I became a father to you. In a time you had a lot of teachers, but you didn't have many fathers, and I became a father to you because I brought you into the truth, and now you guys going to turn on me? You see. And so John here is saying, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to the strangers. And notice what he's saying here. He's saying John is hospitable to the brethren. And it's not that he's just picking up any stray person and bringing them into his home, but a stranger would be one who, like for instance, Daniel, my brother. And there are few people here who don't know you, but those who don't know you, you would be what? A stranger to them. Doesn't mean you're not a believer, but they don't know you. And so when people came to Gaius, they were strangers, but they could have been brothers. And even if they came from John, they were still strangers to Gaius, but they came with the testimony and the endorsement of John, whom he was familiar with. And so John is writing, he's saying, listen, beloved, be faithful whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to the strangers. And they have borne witness of your charity before the ecclesia. So now what are they doing? They're going to another place and testifying. You know, when Yeshua, that woman who anointed him, and he said she would be remembered, folks would be talking about her for years and millenniums to come. You see, when you serve in the capacity Jehovah and his people, you become a person with a reputation. Not that you're trying to make a reputation, it's just that your service causes people to testify, and your name gets carried to other places where people don't know you because of your service. And so he's saying, which have borne witness of thy charity before the ecclesia, whom if they bring forward on their journey after godly sort, thou shalt do well. Now this language here is loaded, because if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort translates into some brethren came. They expended the resources they had to get there. But now that they're there, John is saying Gaius is the kind of person who not only receive them and take care of them, but make sure they got what they need to get to their next destination. He don't send them away with the Burger King coupon. You hear what I'm saying? He's not giving them $5 and telling them to go down to the Steak and Shake. But of course, you got to go back down that way, even though you're going that way. And so the $5 you go to Steak and Shake is going to be expended in mule feed. And then you got to come back and get all the way over there. But see, what John not only opened up his, Gaius not only opened up his home and opened up his heart, but he also opened up his wallet. And he took care of them. And now John's got this kind of report. Gaius was charitable toward those who brought the gospel, and he supported their work. In verse 7, because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. And so what is he saying here? He's saying, listen, when they came forth, now this particular his name's sake could mean Yeshua or Yehovah. It's what it could mean, because we don't know. But because that for his name's sake, they went forth. They were bringing the gospel of Yeshua. But the gospel of Yeshua came from whom? Yehovah. Yeshua said it very clearly. He could do nothing. And he didn't say except that which was given to him. And so he says, because that for his name's sake. So these individuals were those who were in the service of Yehovah in the name of Yeshua. And that's what they preached. That's what they taught. And so when he came, they didn't have to go and beg. When they came, they didn't have to go and get temporary work for a temporary service. John said Gaius took care of them and sent them forth, and because of that, they didn't have to get anything from non-believers. The believers took care of them. He supported them and made sure they had what they needed for the journey ahead of them. Verse 8 and 9, we therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. And then it takes a turn. I wrote unto the ecclesia, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have preeminence among them, received us not. And so what is John saying? John is saying, listen, I was headed in that direction. I'm coming to your city. And I wanted to make the congregation aware of our coming. And so I wrote them and said, I'm coming. I'm going to be in your city. I'm going to be in your region. And obviously, Diotrephes wrote back. Now, we don't know what he said, but what John is saying he said is that he is not going to receive us. But this is not going to stop John from going. But he's saying that if we go, we know we're not going to be welcome there. Not only are we not going to be welcome, and this interesting that Diotrephes' personal name means nurtured by Jove, and that word Jove is Jupiter. You ever hear some English people say, by Jove? By Jove? That word in some English-speaking Americans, and when I say English-speaking Americans, I'm not talking about American-speaking Americans, but by Jove is by Jupiter. And Diotrephes was named a name meaning by Jupiter, which suggests, and again I say this suggests, that before the gospel came to their town, to their city, to their region, religion was already there. Religion has been in communities since the very beginning. There are people who have religion. And so when the gospel came, it's like, okay, there's a new religion coming. There's a propagator of a new sect. And this is why people would call Paul a babbler, because they're saying, okay, there's a babbler in town who's propagating some new religion, so we're going to go down and see what this babbler's got to say. That's basically what they're saying, because there were people who came and they stood in the marketplace, or they stood in a particular area, and they would proclaim whatever it is, whether they were selling something or they were proclaiming the gospel. And so it was a place where everyone had a soapbox or a box in which they could present whatever their wares, their sales, or even their doctrine. And so Diotrephes' mom named him this, meaning by Jupiter, which suggests that she was a worshiper of idols. People who worship the Jupiter, people who worship the moon, people who worship the sun, people who worship the stars, and all of that. And so you had all of this idol type worship going on. And then the name also refers to a individual, or Diotrephes mean nurtured by Jupiter, an individual whose self-serving ambition is cited unfavorably. And the writer of the letter declared that Diotrephes rejected his authority. And so John had some authority, and this is from Holman, but Diotrephes was a person who rejected the authority of John. Diotrephes wanted to have the preeminence or to be first and refused to accept those sent by John who were missionaries. Now, this is another one of those circumstances whereas Paul established the congregation in Corinth, but at some point they rejected Paul's authority. And of course, that's one of the things that led to 2 Corinthians, because the people that he birthed have now decided they've outgrown him, that he's no longer their father. They've got others. I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of this. And so you had all of this going on, and Paul is dumbfounded that people that he brought into the faith has now turned on him. But Father told Ananias that this one is going to suffer much for my name. And much of, I believe, what Paul experienced was because of what Paul had sown. You see, the principle of sowing and reaping. Paul had sown some really nasty, horrible seeds. He beat people. He drug people out of their homes. He threw people who were walking in truth in jail. He persecuted the saints. And now he's being persecuted in all of his doing. You see, God is not mocked. Jehovah is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. And it doesn't matter that you have now come into the faith, because the seed harvest is not coming because you done got saved. The seed harvest is coming because you planted it. You see. And so when you plant a seed, you will reap a harvest. May not be the harvest you want, which is why you have to be careful about the seed you plant. And so Paul had to go through a lot of issues with people and congregations that he established. Now, maybe if he had resided over those congregations and never left to go and establish other congregations, they would have continued in their familiarity with Paul, but because they left, others rose up and decided that we don't need him anymore, you got me. And it's possible that this was Diotrephes, because in fact, Gaius and John knew Gaius, and Demetrius and John knew Demetrius, and Demetrius knew John, and Diotrephes responded to John as if John had no authority, suggests that John has brought faith because Gaius is there, and therefore Diotrephes is saying, you are no longer authoritative here. He said he loved preeminence, to be first. Now, he wanted to be first, but he wasn't. He wasn't identified as an apostle, but he was identified as one who was in some sort of leadership position. And so he says, John says, wherefore if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth. But John identifies it. Not only does Diotrephes rejects and don't want them to come, but he starts bad-mouthing them. He's prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith. In other words, he's not satisfied in his calling and his ministry. He is the kind of person who feels that in order for him to be exalted, he got to tear down legitimate leadership. So now what he's doing is he's using malicious words. He's bad-mouthing John. Neither do he himself receive the brethren. So he's not only rejecting me, but he's rejecting the brethren. Like, we don't need y'all. We don't need you. I got this. Not recognizing that there are apostles, there are prophets, there are evangelists, there are teachers and pastors, and this is not a one-man job. It can't be done by one called gift. It needs all of the ministry calling that the Almighty has given. And so he says, he is not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would. In other words, he's not accepting anybody coming, and if you accept such and such to come in here, we're going to put you out. He says, and he cast them out. So this shows that this person has some authority. He falsely accused John and the other apostles of those sent by John and anyone who came to share the word of Jehovah. Now, remember, John wrote in 1 John, he wrote in the 5 chapters, he even touched on some in 2 John, that there were those who were coming and they had the wrong message. They were anti-messiahs. They were individuals who were coming, and they were coming in the name, they would come in the name of Messiah. They would come in the name of Christ. That's why he called them anti-messiahs. And you will know them by their teachings. If they come teaching and preaching something other than what we're teaching and preaching, John says, do not accept them. Don't receive them. Don't even bid them Godspeed. Don't support their work. So John is adamant about the truth, but now here you have someone who is rejecting the truth because he is the only legitimate truth and no one else has truth. So you could say that John is writing to, one of those people who are part of a denomination who says we're the only one who got the truth, but he's even taking it further. It's like, I'm the only one who got the truth. And so we know that John has made it very clear that we have to be mindful of individuals. Now remember, this is not 2018 where there's churches on every corner. This is in a time when the gospel has barely got out of Jerusalem or Judea or Samaria. And now it's in Asia Minor, Asia. It hasn't reached outside of Europe and certain areas in Europe. It hasn't gone to the different continents. So it's in one location, and it's in one location because of the travel and because of individuals who have taken it upon themselves to volunteer to be missions. They didn't have jobs. They didn't have the support structure that people rely on and depend upon. They weren't guaranteed an offering. In fact, there were hostilities in many of the places that they went and resistance. And this is why some of them had to work. Some of them had to get some kind of temporary employment so they would have a place to sleep. And I would dare say they didn't sleep in no 3-star, 2-star, 4-star, 5-star hotel. Some of them found a rock in an alley somewhere away from traffic just to get some sleep for tonight if nobody took them into their homes. And we can see if you came to Diotrephes' territory, you weren't going to be welcomed And that's why John is commending Gaius, because you've welcomed strangers when they wouldn't even be welcomed in the place of fellowship. They wouldn't be welcomed in a place where they should be. John suggests that he will bring to remembrance the deeds of Diotrephes when he comes. John is either not going to forget, bring this matter to the brethren there, or possibly to Diotrephes himself. And so it is almost as if John is suggesting that he's going to come, and when he comes, he's not going to forget how he has been treated by this individual, and he wants the other people to know that this is what you're dealing with, and he may even have to, if it comes down to it, speak to Diotrephes himself. We know John indicated in the closing verse that his intent was to come. So he's coming. In verse 11, beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of Elohim, but he that doeth evil hath not seen him. Unlike the bad name Diotrephes had among the brethren, there was a fellow by the name of Demetrius who had a good report of all and was one who knew truth. And John knew of Demetrius' good reputation and bore witness just as he knew of Diotrephes' bad reputation. Demetrius had good report of all men, John writes, and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record. And you know that our record is true. And so what is he saying is that, listen, I've spoken to you about Diotrephes. You know he's a bad dude. You know the kind of stuff he's doing. But I also want to let you know about Demetrius, because Demetrius has a good reputation. Now, we don't know if Gaius and Demetrius knew each other, but we know from John's writing, if they didn't know each other, they know each other now, or they know of each other, and that they're in proximity to one another. According to Scripture, the New Testament, there are two Demetriuses mentioned. One, the name, which is also a Greek name belonging to Demeter, and Demeter was a Greek goddess of crops. Now, this is interesting. Because the assumption is that Demetrius is a man. But who names their son after a goddess? It's just one of those things that are there. Maybe it's the male form of a female. I mean, it's possible. But belonging to Demeter, the Greek goddess of crops, it's just most men, and there are some situations, because we know that French people have a tendency to give their sons names that here in the United States would be considered a woman's name. I was trying to think of one right off the top of my head. What? Huh? Yeah, Jean. But it looks like Jean. That's one of them. Gail. That's another. And so there are names that individuals have that men are named, and there are individuals who have seemingly feminine names. But anyway, moving forward, the first Demetrius is a silversmith in Ephesus. He incited a riot directed against Paul because he feared that the apostles' preaching would threaten the sale of silver shrines of Diana, the patron goddess of Ephesus. And Demetrius may have been a guild master in the charge of producing small silver copies of Diana's temple with the figure of the goddess inside. And we know that in Acts chapter 19, that this person incited this riot, saying this man has come and he's causing a problem. He's telling people to turn away from the goddess and that kind of thing. And then people begin to shout the goddess name in the streets. And next thing you know, Paul got arrested. And, we'll get to that in our sojourning through Acts. The second is this one, apparently a convert from the worship of Demeter, the god worshipped in the mystery religion at Elias near Athens. And so John commended him, saying, he hath good report of all men and of the truth itself. In 3 John 1, verse 13, he says, I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen. And so he closes this letter similar to how he closed the first, 2 John, when he wrote to the elect later. He says, listen, there are things that I want to write, there are things that I want to say, but I'm not going to write them down and send to you. But I trust I shall shortly see you, and we shall speak face to face. And this is one of the, letters are wonderful. Just as brothers and sisters who have come here, who are accustomed to being with us online, there's a big difference being online than it is being here. And especially on our feast gatherings, as we were together for our dedication celebration, and when we have our Sabbath services, it's a difference. And so, we continue our Thursday service because it's an opportunity for us to minister some things that we may not necessarily get to minister on Sabbath, and also to continue to encourage the saints in other subject matters. And now we're going through searching the scriptures. And so there is a difference, and some people see it and some people feel it. But I'm going to tell you, on our Sabbath services and our feast services, this place, we almost ran out of seats. And so Passover is coming up, and we intend to pack this house out. Hallelujah. We're even thinking about overflow, trying to figure out how to do that. So those of you who are going to register and plan on being here, you better register early, because we're going to have seat assignments. We're going to set people at tables. It won't be, take whatever chair you want. We're going to have everything assigned, and those who RSVP will get first choice at seats. Those who don't RSVP will have to wait and get, what is not RSVP'd. So that's a warning. That's just a heads up to let you know to get your RSVP in for Passover as soon as possible, so that you would be guaranteed a seat in the big room. Hallelujah. Otherwise, we may have to get you at the kiddie table in the overflow. But anyway, please, RSVP, you are welcomed whether you're in the big room or in the overflow. But get your RSVP in. And so he says, I trust I shall see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. And then a common greeting, peace be unto you. And a shalom aleichem. Our friends salute thee, and greet the friends by name. And so he's saying, just as he did when he wrote to the elect ladies, that the elect lady's sister and her children salute you and greet you. We'll see you all when we come. Greet one another. Our friends salute you, and then greet the friends. And so that is the closing of John, and we got through it in an ample amount of time. Hallelujah. Shalom, saints. Tithing and giving first fruit offerings are critical parts of the believer's faith, and has its foundation back in Genesis 4:4, when Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And Jehovah had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Abel was commended by Jehovah in Hebrews 11:4, where it states that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Solomon said in Proverbs 3:9-10, Honor Jehovah with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall your barns be filled with plenty, and your presses shall burst out with new wine. The prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, to bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, says Jehovah of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there should not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, says Jehovah of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith Jehovah of hosts. When we tithe and give offerings consistently in obedience to Jehovah's commandments, we can count on him to keep his promises to us and consistently meet all of our needs. It is our Father's desire to bless you. However, it begins with you and your act of obedience to tithe and give offerings. Do it today. Shalom.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. House of Israel International Services is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Thank you.